return them. Today I address the systematic campaign of disinformation that has been propagated by several Bolivian media outlets including A Sol y Sombra, ABC and abi.bo. What we are witnessing is not journalism, but rather a calculated assault on indigenous rights and Hindu communities worldwide. I will address these fabricated allegations with precision and truth. By what authority do media outlets like A Sol y Sombra, ABC and abi.bo claim the power to recognize or unrecognize nations? This authority doesn't even rest with the United Nations itself. Let me be very clear. KAILASA fulfills all criteria for statehood as established in the Montevideo Convention of 1933. It has a permanent population, it has a defined territory, it has a functioning government, and it has the capacity to enter into international relations. The Montevideo Convention of 1933, which Bolivia itself has ratified, explicitly states in Article 3 that the political existence of a state is independent of recognition by other states. The fundamental principle of international law applies to KAILASA as much as it does to any sovereign entity. Your characterization of KAILASA as fictional represents a fundamental attack on indigenous sovereignty and self-determination rights. This is not merely a systematic disagreement. It is a calculated attempt to erase the existence of indigenous Hindu communities worldwide. Understand, the agreements you question are between a US-based Hindu organization and indigenous Bolivian communities. These are conservation partnerships that explicitly respect indigenous ownership and sovereignty, not land acquisition or land grabs in any sense of the word. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory to these agreements. Your deliberate misattribution reveals your intention to attack Hindu leadership specifically. See, these partnerships with the indigenous communities focus on support for environmental protection and sustainable management, preservation of indigenous knowledge systems, humanitarian aid and development assistance, cultural exchange and promotion of indigenous rights. All agreements are fully compliant with the Bolivian law numbered 465 and the ILO Convention 169. These are conservation partnerships, not territorial claims, endorsed by indigenous leaders who retained sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. The economic components of agreements between the US-based organization and indigenous Bolivian communities are not payments for land, but rather investments in community development, environmental protection, and cultural preservation, resources managed by these communities themselves. Indigenous communities themselves, exercising their constitutional right to self-determination, determined the appropriate value of these conservation partnerships. Your suggestion that indigenous leaders cannot determine fair value for their communities denies their intelligence and agency. Your fixation on monetary amounts reveals a capitalist framework that commodifies land, which is contrary to indigenous perspectives that value relationships and reciprocity. Why do you focus on consensual financial agreements between indigenous communities and Hindu organizations while completely ignoring the massive exploitation of indigenous lands by extractive industries like mining? These partnerships explicitly honor indigenous sovereignty, with all agreements containing provisions that recognize indigenous autonomy and decision-making processes. Article 30, Section 2.4 of Bolivia's constitution explicitly guarantees indigenous peoples the right to self-determination and territoriality. Indigenous communities exercise precisely this constitutional right when forming these voluntary partnerships. The real violation of indigenous sovereignty is the paternalistic suggestion that indigenous communities need protection from forming partnerships of their choosing, a colonial mindset that treats indigenous people as incapable of making informed decisions. The allegation that Hindu organizations sought to impose foreign religious practices represents profound ignorance of both indigenous spiritual traditions worldwide and deep ancestral connections that bind them together. Hindu organizations promote religious freedom and respect for all spiritual traditions. They have never sought to impose religious practices on any community. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has consistently taught respect for all indigenous spiritual traditions worldwide. The profound spiritual connection between Hindu traditions and indigenous Bolivian cosmology are extensively documented. The Andean deity Pachamama, Mother Earth, and the Tamil Hindu goddess Pachai Amman, means Green Mother, share not only parallel names but nearly identical attributes as Earth Mothers who sustain life and ecological harmony. Bolivia's Constitution Article 4 guarantees freedom of religion and spiritual beliefs, while Article 21, Section 3 enshrines the right to freedom of thought, spirituality, religion, and worship. So why do these protections not apply to Hindu traditions? The personal attacks against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism reveal a systematic campaign of religious persecution against Hindu leadership specifically, and entire Hindu diaspora more broadly. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a self-proclaimed guru. His lineage traces back through ancient Hindu spiritual institutions with formal recognition from traditional authorities, including the 68th Jagadguru Shankaracharya of Kanchi Kamakoti Peetham. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has been completely exonerated by multiple courts worldwide. Complete judicial exoneration by the Gujarat High Court in February 2, 2024. US court vindication with nearly $500,000 awarded for defamation. The Karnataka High Court protection declaring the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's arrest as illegal and without jurisdiction. And there's also medical evidences proving biological impossibility of allegations. And then there's also Interpol's refusal to issue notices recognizing the political nature of these persecutions. Your continued promotion of allegations explicitly rejected by courts worldwide reveals this has nothing to do with journalism, but rather it is a targeted religious persecution. The claim that indigenous communities reject agreements with KAILASA is a fabrication designed to drive a wedge between indigenous communities worldwide. No legitimate indigenous communities have spoken against partnership with Hindu organizations through proper channels. These supposed rejections are either fabricated or represent small fractions not representative of the wider community. You are manufacturing the false narrative that indigenous communities are against Hindu partnerships. This is a classical divide and conquer tactic used throughout colonial history. What is actually happening is that indigenous communities who have formed legitimate diplomatic relations with Hindu organizations are being pressured and intimidated. These communities face tremendous pressure when they exercise their constitutional rights to self-determination. What you frame as political controversy is actually standard diplomatic protocol, followed by representatives of all nations seeking to build international relationships. Meeting with government officials is precisely how international relations function. You imply impropriety in normal diplomatic activities, activities you would never question from Western nations or organizations. This double standard reveals a colonial mindset that indigenous organizations should not engage in international diplomacy. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not directly involved in these diplomatic initiatives. These are independent actions by a US-based organization. Your deliberate conflation reveals your intent to persecute the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism specifically. The allegation of false representation at international forums is a deliberate attempt to delegitimize legitimate participation in global governments by Hindu and indigenous representatives. Hindu and indigenous representatives have legitimately participated in various UN forums on human rights, indigenous issues, and religious freedom following established protocols for civil society and indigenous representation. The United Nations has published over 21 reports documenting the persecution faced by KAILASA and indigenous Hindu communities worldwide, recognizing the legitimate concerns of these persecuted groups. You deliberately mischaracterize legitimate UN forum participation as sneaking in or misrepresentation, a language you never applied to Western NGOs or other religious groups participating in identical processes. The allegations of threats and intimidation is a fabrication to silence legitimate criticism of your persecution campaign and criminalize Hindu advocacy. No Hindu representatives have engaged in any threatening behavior. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has consistently taught and promoted non-violence, ahimsa, as a fundamental principle. What you characterize as threats are actually legitimate legal notifications informing media outlets of their defamatory content and requesting corrections, a standard journalistic accountability mechanism used by organizations worldwide. You provide zero specific evidence of actual threats, no threatening messages, no intimidation tactics, no witness testimony, because none exist. The allegation of divisive community tactics is a colonial projection that attributes your own divide and conquer strategies to Hindu organizations engaging respectfully with indigenous communities. Hindu representatives have consistently engaged with indigenous communities through their legitimate governance structures and leadership. All agreements explicitly acknowledge and respect traditional decision-making processes. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has consistently taught and promoted respect for traditional indigenous governance systems as a fundamental principle. What you characterize as division is actually indigenous communities exercising their constitutional right to self-determination, including the right to form relationships outside of colonial control structures. What we are witnessing from these media outlets is not journalism, but weaponized media, serving as the enforcement arm of anti-indigenous and anti-Hindu interests. Your systematic distortions, fabrications, and deliberate omissions follow the exact historical pattern that has preceded violence against religious minorities throughout history. We stand today at a critical historical moment where anti-indigenous colonial media has launched an unprecedented campaign of hate speech and persecution against indigenous Hindu communities worldwide. To the indigenous communities facing media persecution, we stand with unwavering solidarity with your right to self-determination. We will not be silenced. We will not allow anti-indigenous media to erase our existence or deny our fundamental rights to self-determination and international engagement. The world is watching, history is being recorded, and the truth will prevail.